As President Trump gets ready to address Congress and the nation about foreign policy, trade relations, and spending cuts, some grim productions are coming from former USAID officials about the future of that agency. Joining us right now is House Energy and Commerce Committee member, Congressman Jake Auchincloss, also former USAID Global Health Administrator, Assistant Administrator, Dr. Atul Gawande. Dr. Gawande will be the congressman's guest at the president's address this evening. And, Congressman, I guess, welcome to both of you, first of all. I guess the first question is, why are you bringing Dr. Gawande tonight?
Good morning. Thanks for having us on. I'm bringing Dr. Gawande because he is an eminent surgeon and public health expert who can help humanize the effects of Trump's lies about USAID. Donald Trump is telling two lies to the American public about USAID. First, he's trying to claim that he can pay for his tax cuts for the rich by cutting investments in global public health and basic research funding, when in fact those investments are a small fraction of the federal budget. He's actually going to pay for these tax cuts for the rich by taking an axe to Medicaid, which funds at-home care for seniors and primary care for 40% of American children. He doesn't want people talking about that, so he wants to distract Americans by focusing on foreign aid. The second lie that Donald Trump is telling the American people is that somehow this funding for global public health is wasteful, or the funding for basic research here at home is wasteful. In fact, there are few returns on investment that are higher impact than funding science and public health. And if you doubt that, ask the 200,000 kids globally who are going to get polio and be paralyzed next year if we withdraw funding, and the instability and chaos that will sow overseas. Or ask the kids in Texas and Georgia who are getting measles right now because RFK has helped derail measles vaccination campaigns.
Dr. Gawande, I see you nodding at that. Why don't we talk about what happens with foreign aid being cut back, what you see actually playing out on the health of the globe and the nation?
Yeah, we saw just last week the termination of over 90% of the staff of USAID and of the contracts of USAID. This wiped out the entirety of the global malaria program, the entirety of the global tuberculosis program, 3/4 of an HIV program that is keeping 20 million people alive, including 500,000 children. So you're going to see a surge of these diseases that we have held at bay. There are other things USAID does that protects food security, reduces instability in countries, and it is now a massive pullout and abandonment of these efforts, and we're seeing the damage already. When you do a surgery on the U.S. government with a chainsaw, we're seeing the results, and it's a debacle.
Is there any effort underway to go back? Because, look, what we see publicly, at least on X, that's put out there is some of the USAID dollars that are spent on far more questionable things than trying to fight things like malaria and polio. Is there any effort afoot to try and go after some of those very programs and make sure that they can stay in place, Congressman?
Cherry-picking examples of spending in order to throw the baby out with the bathwater is a time-honored tradition in Washington, D.C. I can talk about how the Department of Defense spends tens of thousands of dollars on toilet seats or millions of dollars on Alaskan king crab. But I'm not talking about defunding the entire Pentagon. I think the military is important. I think the military occasionally spends things unwisely. There is no federal program that I'm aware of that has zero waste, fraud, or abuse. But there are also very few federal programs that have a higher return on investment than basic science and global public health. And we saw the impacts of that and how it affects Americans here at home just 5 years ago with COVID, when lack of monitoring and lack of global public health infrastructure helped create a pandemic.
I guess part of the frustration comes with the idea that there is a lot of waste and fraud that takes place, and how do we get at that without, how do we get at that effectively without killing some of the programs you're talking about?
Well, let me jump in a little bit on this. There have been 6 years of Inspector General reports going back to the first Trump administration and the current, the Biden administration. They reviewed and audited 94% of USAID spending. They found 0.3% that was questionable. They recouped half of that. So the notion that there is extraordinary widespread fraud, this is a program that I led Global Health on half the budget of my hospital system up in Boston, and they were reaching hundreds of millions of people and saving people's lives by the millions. There probably is ways to make it more efficient, but I can't find a better buy for American security and for humanity.
If it's not fraud, they will say, look, I'm just looking right now, some of the expenses that people would find very questionable. Things like money, $1 million to boost French-speaking LGBTQ programs in West and Central Africa through the State Department, $15 million for condoms in different areas. I mean, those are the types of things that rile up the public. How do you get at some of those problems that may not be things that the American electorate are thrilled about funding, whereas you probably would have a much higher American public turnout for things like polio, measles. And look, maybe not for everybody. It may not be something that was voted straight up or down, but you could probably make the case for the return you get and the safety we get back here in this country as a result.
Well, let me jump in on the $50 million for condoms supposedly
15.
in Gaza,
Yeah.
$0. Even
$15 million for condoms
$0.
in the Taliban.
Yeah, $0 went for that. What we saw instead, and we can talk, for example, about transgender. HIV programs are caring for transgender people who are at extremely high risk of getting HIV and transmitting HIV. You can't do an HIV program without addressing populations, that men who have sex with men, transgender populations, and so on. Excising them like we've done now means that these diseases are going to come back. And these can be cast in ways that make it sound like it's wasteful. But in reality, this is the work that you do when you take reality seriously.
So, Dr. Gawande, tell me where you think we'll be in a year if these programs aren't reinstituted, just from a global health perspective.
Well, at this point, the damage to the agency is done, the expertise lost. We already see projections that it's in the hundreds of thousands of deaths that we have increases, that we'll see return of polio, that we'll see surges of measles. All these things are already happening. We have a death from measles in Texas for the first time in years. And this is now only getting worse unless we take supporting these institutions, getting them back on track. I have a lot of concern that the damage is already done.